Hi, I'm Andrew Nelson. I'm really glad you could join us. And whether you're here in person or watching online, we want you to participate in the discussion. To facilitate that, we'll be using Slido.com, a simple, interactive platform for live Q&A and polling during events. So here's what you'll need to do. First, open a browser on your device. Then, type in Slido.com. Then, enter event code CAPRI. And that's it, you're live. From here, you'll be able to send in your questions, upvote the questions of others, and participate in live polls. We recommend stating your name and location, but that's not a requirement. And that's it. You're all set to engage with us throughout this event.
The Jamaica National Budget is more than a financial statement. It tells a story about where Jamaica is and where Jamaica intends to go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Kashim Lawrence, and I'm the Communications Assistant at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. CAPRI is an independent think tank devoted to evidence-based research towards improved public policy making in Jamaica and the Caribbean. This evening, we'll be taking you on an annual journey of deep diving into Jamaica's national budget, moving beyond the headlines and examining what the numbers mean for the future of Jamaica and the future for Jamaicans. It is my pleasure to welcome the Honorable Favour Williams, Minister of Finance and the Public Service, members of CAPRI's Board of Directors, or good corporate partners across the private sector, academia, and civil society, and all engaged Jamaicans and friends of Jamaica joining us here at the University of West Indies Regional Headquarters or online via CAPRI's YouTube channel. This is your budget, and your presence this evening gives this conversation real meaning. As we navigate the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa, Jamaica faces the difficult task of balancing fiscal recovery with long-term development ambitions. CAPRI's Budget Breakdown 2026, Paying for Hurricane Melissa, will provide the evidence-based analysis that helps all of us to understand what comes next for our country. Throughout the evening, we want to hear from you. Whether you are here with us at the UWI Regional Headquarters or watching online, submit your questions via Slido, visit slido.com, and enter the event code CAPRI. For those who missed that, here's the instructions on screen, and we'll remind you of it throughout the evening. Note that is all lowercase CAPRI. Following my remarks, we'll hear from our sponsor, Mrs. Tina Matalon from Restaurants of Jamaica. We will then move into the key findings from this year's budget breakdown by CAPRI's Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, after which we'll see a short video highlighting the perspective of a young Jamaican balancing financial hardships in light of Hurricane Melissa and her future aspirations. This will be followed by a one-on-one conversation between Dr. King and the Honorable Favour Williams, unpacking the priorities, trade-offs, and implications of this year's national budget for Jamaica's path forward. With that, I invite Mrs. Tina Matalon to share her opening remarks.
Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here this evening, particularly at a time when conversations like this carry real weight for the future of our country. And we are pleased to support ROJ and through Brand KFC, pleased to lend our support to a forum that brings together perspectives that are so critical to that discussion and the discussions we'll hear tonight. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Favour Williams, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. Minister, thank you for lending your perspective and leadership here this evening. And I did have the pleasure of seeing you just this week at another event where a group of private sector gathered and heard her thoughts on the future of Jamaica, highlights of the budget, and how the private sector and public sector need to stay together, come together, and drive the future forward. And it was very insightful. So no doubt we'll be further enlightened this evening. Dr. Damian King, Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, thank you for the invitation. Not often do you see Restaurants of Jamaica or KFC or brands of the like on such a forum. But thank you for the invitation and for creating a space for this kind of open dialogue. Other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, any members of the media that may be here, everyone, good evening. This forum creates an important space to examine the numbers, the policies, and the decisions that will shape how Jamaica moves forward. At the same time, behind every figure and every number and every statistic, behind every digit or course of action is a lived experience that continues to influence how we think about recovery. Recent events have reminded us just how quickly those realities can shift. As the theme of this evening's budget breakdown, Paying for Melissa, you know, the big event, moments like Hurricane Melissa not only tested our infrastructure, but also our ability to respond, to support, and to stand with each other in meaningful ways. And in doing so, showed just how capable we are of coming together as a people. While the full scale of that experience is difficult to capture through upgrades or images or even statistics, what stays with us and what stays with you are the realities on the ground, the communities trying to rebuild, the families navigating uncertainty, and the first responders and volunteers working tirelessly to support those in need. We can all remember what that was like. It is in those moments that the role of organizations such as ours and many others, whether private or public, comes into sharp focus. We need to recognize what our role is in the whole argument of rebuilding Jamaica. At Restaurants of Jamaica and KFC, giving back sits within the DNA of our brand. That's no surprise to anybody. Whether through education, sports, national initiatives, or moments of need, such as the moment of Melissa, we have always believed that our responsibility to serve extends beyond the walls of our restaurants and into how we show up for the communities and our teams that we are a part of. In the immediate aftermath, as families across the affected areas began to come to terms with the scale of the damage, our focus quickly shifted to how we could support in a way that was both immediate and meaningful. Across our restaurants, we mobilized a meal support initiative to prepare and distribute over 2,000 meals daily across the affected areas, particularly in the West, ensuring that families and essential workers had access to something as simple yet as important and overlooked as a hot meal. In Black River in particular, we repurposed one of our restaurants into a recovery hub, solely open and operational to serve meals free to the community and to that parish, before returning it to their commercial operations for weeks, allowing us to better support the coordination efforts on the ground and extend assistance to that entire parish easily from that hub. As the weeks progressed, that effort continued to grow, with our teams working tirelessly to scale operations, ultimately providing more than 75,000 meals to those on the ground. We are so proud of that. Thank you. Alongside that, we provided direct cash support to key agencies and organizations that all played such a critical role, including ODPEM, the Salvation Army, Food for the Poor, Samaritan's Purse, children's homes, schools, all across the West, ensuring that our assistance reached multiple levels. In total, when you consider our combined efforts, meals, cash, packages, all that was done, it represented an investment of over $80 million into relief and recovery efforts. Not unlike many other private sector entities that have CSR at the priority or at the forefront of their beliefs, not unlike any of them have done, so we commend them all. The level of response would not have been possible without the dedication of our team members, however. Many who were affected themselves, yet they showed up, worked long hours, supported our distribution efforts with a real sense of purpose, understanding that what we were working to accomplish, everybody, was bigger than any one person could do on their own. As we supported communities, we also had to show up for our own teams. Family first, right? Through our internal recovery efforts, we provided care packages, cash support, and meal support, ensuring that they too were cared for during that period. Because the support had to flow both ways, external and internal. I remember visiting in the aftermath, right there in Black River, where it was interesting and quite remarkable that the KFC in Black River was one of the only things still standing in Black River. I remember visiting with Minister Green, and although the devastation was overwhelming and the reality was overwhelming, the stories of resilience and humanity were just inspiring. Like, it was incredible how both our teams and the community came together. One thing we understood very early on is that recovery does not happen in isolation. It requires a unified effort, with organizations coming together to extend reach and deepen impact. Through that kind of collaboration, working alongside agencies and organizations across both the public and private sector, including our own partners like Jamaica Broilers, Pepsi, and many others, we were able to support and reach those who needed it most very quickly. It also speaks to the contribution the private sector continues to make, not just in supporting recovery efforts, but in helping to move the country forward, using its reach, our resources, our influence to help shape and rebuild, not just to where we were previous to the event, but towards something much bigger and much stronger and much more resilient. That same spirit of shared responsibility is what makes forums like this so important. CAPRI serves a critical function in shaping the kind of informed, evidence-based thinking that helps national decision-making, particularly at a time when choices we make will directly influence how we rebuild and move forward as a country. They create a platform not just for this discussion and discussions like these, but for alignment, which is critical, where government, research bodies, and private sector can engage more intentionally in how we contribute to national development. And that should not be just in the act of a one-off act of support, but as a sustained and integrated responsibility. As we look ahead, the focus shifts to what comes next. How we rebuild, how we strengthen, how we prepare for what we know is going to continue to test us. God forbid we get another event. This is where continued collaboration becomes essential, particularly as we move forward and move from recovery and response to rebuild, with each sector playing its part and contributing in ways that are both sustained and impactful. From our standpoint, we remain committed in doing our part, showing up where it matters, in ways that make a real difference and a real impact in contributing to a stronger and more prepared Jamaica. As we talk about rebuilding, we also contribute to building, with 4 restaurants on the horizon to open this year alone, and we're already Q1 is done. That means hundreds of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, and more access all across Jamaica. So commitment to building and rebuilding. I want to again commend this organization, CAPRI, for the important work you continue to do in bringing together thoughtful, data-driven perspectives that help shape how we move forward as a country. Dr. King, my hat goes off to you and your team for the role you continue to play in guiding these conversations and helping to translate, so importantly, insight into action. Thank you for being a part of this, for letting us be a part of this. We are privileged to be here. Thank you so much.
It's good to know that amidst the devastation of Melissa, when water was cut off, electricity was cut off, people didn't have internet, the essential service was maintained, KFC. just to give you a sense of the, you have seen the pictures, you have seen the videos, you have visited the West and may have seen the destruction for yourself. But just to give you a sense of the scale of what happened. Half of all the value produced in Jamaica in 1 year was destroyed in a single afternoon in October. But we are not here to talk about the physical and larger economic impact. A lot has been said about that. We want to narrow the focus to the fiscal impact. We want to spend the entire length of this presentation talking about the scale of the headache on the minister. And as always with CAPRI's presentations, we have an agenda. So we will get to that. In a typical year these days, the minister has about $1,200 billion to allocate. That kind of exaggerates the amount of discretion, though, because $500 billion of that is salaries and other staff costs. No discretion there. Another $200 billion is interest on our even shrunken debt. Constitutionally, there's no discretion there either. So that leaves about $500 billion for capital expenditure and programs. And even that exaggerates the amount of discretion because most of that is tied up in commitments. But even with that, by CAPRI's calculations, the fiscal cost to the government over the 2025-26 fiscal year and the 2026-27 fiscal year, whose budget was presented this week, last week and this week, the total cost to the government over those two fiscal years amounts to $200 billion. How do you accommodate 40% of your CapEx and program budget blowing up in an afternoon? Well, so we're going to talk about Melissa, but not Melissa as a one-off event. We are tempted to think about Melissa as a one-off event. But we're going to talk about Melissas. We're going to talk about the fact that this kind of thing keeps happening to us. That, not only do we settle into a groove and something else hits Jamaica. Since independence, there have been 8 named storms. And it's not just about storms. We have had COVID. We have had the bank crisis. We have had the global financial crisis. We have had oil price shocks. We have trade disruptions. We have had 9/11. We have 3 wars breaking out at the same time. Things keep happening. That's the reality in which we live. As a small island economy, in the middle of a storm path, vulnerability is a regular feature of our lives. We try to do, we do this exercise every year, and we try to analyze trends. And we discover that we don't get a long enough period of stability, of normalcy, to be able to look at trends. So what we need to wrap our minds around is that irregular but frequent disruptions, explosions, things that happen is a reality we need to contend with. Because given our size and location, Jamaica is pretty much perfectly poised to bear the brunt of much of what happens in the world. Well, Caribbean islands in general. So let's talk about resilience. But not the resilience that everybody else has been talking about since October. not, road durability and utility reliability and flood control and roof strapping, not the physical infrastructural resilience. We are going to spend our time talking about fiscal resilience. So if we don't have fiscal resilience, then when a disaster happens, whether a natural disaster, whether a hurricane, or some economic shock, then the government finds itself in a position where additional expenditures are needed to meet the disaster, to do the reconstruction and relief and the recovery, at the same time that economic activity has shrunk, so the government has less revenue. So it ends up being squeezed on both sides. So they're unable to deliver the normal goods and services that governments do. So this makes you realize that we poor citizens end up being hit by two disasters. The direct effect of the disaster, the hurricane, the pandemic, and then in addition to that, the government having less of an ability and having to retreat from some of its normal activities and services. If we don't have fiscal resilience and the government has to retreat, it has to do things like borrow more money or announce a new tax package, so you end up paying more taxes again, then it ends up amplifying the effect of the disaster. The economy is on a growth path because businesses are investing, and the returns from that investment create value and create jobs and incomes rise. But when individuals and investors are faced with an economic climate that has wide fluctuations, if every few years incomes and returns are cut meaningfully, are cut drastically, sometimes, often, as is the case with hurricanes, below the threshold of survivability, then the decisions we make as individuals and as investors is not to seek out the highest return. It is to seek out the safest activities, the activities that are going to protect us, that are going to hedge against those fluctuations. And so by not seeking out the highest return, we end up, to avoid going below this threshold of subsistence, we end up on a lower growth path because we're not making the highest return investments. We're not seeking out the highest return jobs. I was explaining this to a staff member just before we started, and I suggested, listen, instead of paying you the same amount every month, okay, I'm going to give you a 20% raise, but at the end of every month, a 20% raise on average, but at the end of every month, I'm going to, pull a tab out of a hat, and that determines whether you get paid at all this month. Sometimes you'll get more, sometimes you'll get nothing. Are you going to stay in this job? And she said, no. That's the point. So we are condemned to a lower growth path if we don't have fiscal resilience and the government inadvertently ends up amplifying the effects of shocks. So with that background, in that context, let us look at the cost, the fiscal cost of Melissa. This took some doing. Some of it was easy. So we know that, when we add up all of the announcements and the information we get through the ministry and otherwise, about $33 billion over the 2 fiscal years is for the cost of reconstruction. Another $20 billion is for various programs that are related to Hurricane Melissa, excluding the roofs program. $24 billion is the loan to JPS. The roofs program alone is $10 billion. And $10 billion has been allocated to the new agency that's going to take over reconstruction in the new fiscal year, which is NARA. That's what the government has and will have to spend. What is this? That is the estimated accumulated loss of tax revenue over the 2 fiscal years. It doubles the fiscal cost of the hurricane. And that's how we get to almost $200 billion of fiscal cost. Actually, 198 billion. I exaggerate a bit. How is this paid for? Well, we kind of know that too. So $25 billion comes from the payout of the catastrophe bond. A really impressive bit of financial engineering, I must tell you. Look into the details of it when you have some time. $15 billion was the insurance payout from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. That's the CARICOM insurance facility. $7 billion was released by the government's own sinking funds, the contingency fund and the disaster reserve fund. Here's another $2 billion, which we identified as capital expenditure switched from what it was programmed to do towards Melissa reconstruction. And of course, there was the tax package. The rest of it came from loans from the IMF, the World Bank, and the IDB, facilities that were negotiated for that purpose. The takeaway from this is that the non-debt disaster risk framework accounted for less than a quarter of the fiscal cost of Melissa. The disaster risk framework that Jamaica had in place is impressive. It really is the first time in our entire government history that we had anything like that in place. And yet it accounted for only a quarter of what we estimate as the total fiscal cost of Melissa. So, as impressive and unprecedented as it is, we have a problem. So to talk about where we need to go through what is the disaster risk framework that we have in place. The foundation of it is good fiscal management. The foundation of it is that we have fiscal room because for more than a dozen years, we have mostly balanced budgets, except for during the pandemic. And we have been on a downward debt trajectory. So when something like a hurricane or COVID hits, because we are starting with a balanced budget, because we are starting with low debt, there is fiscal room to be able to absorb it. I'll tell you something. If COVID had hit 5 years before it did, the consequences for Jamaica would have been disastrous. In a climate of regular disasters, this would have been unprecedented. Okay, on top of that foundation now, the disaster risk framework that was established by the Disaster Risk Management Act of 2015. And it separates the architecture of it into 3 levels. At level 1 is for low-intensity, high-frequency events. This is your regular Tuesday flood. Money is drawn from the contingency fund and the disaster reserve fund. At level 2 is for medium-intensity, medium-frequency events. That's where we call upon the CRIF payout and pre-approved credit lines for emergencies that had already been negotiated with and approved by the multilateral agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, and the IDB. Those can be disbursed quickly. And at the top level, for those low frequency but high intensity events, basically for Melissa, then there is the catastrophe bond. It's a parametric instrument, which means the payout doesn't depend upon filling an application form and sending it for somebody to look at the estimated cost of the disaster and make a judgment. It is based on objective measures. It is based on the barometric pressure, parish by parish kind of thing. Brilliant. But not enough. So what is the direction we need to go in? Well, the first is to rebuild the stack. That is to say, to continue to get back to balanced budgets, to continue on our downward debt trajectory, to re-sign for CRIF insurance, which apparently we've already done, to issue a new catastrophe bond, the last one having been already paid out. But all of those, so rebuild is the first thing. But enhancing, expanding the coverage is the second step. All of those need to be done to a greater degree. More insurance, a bigger cat bond, more money into the sinking funds, and then to try to extend the instruments that we have to call on. One possibility is as we roll over our existing debts, if we can put more catastrophe clauses into the new bonds that are replacing the old ones. Now, all of this is going to be expensive. All of these require that the government set aside funds every year to add to the sinking funds, to pay the CRIF premium, to service the catastrophe bond. The people who buy that bond because they are getting a regular payment, a periodic payment, to take on the risk of Melissa's. So you get a bigger cat bond, it's more payment. You get more insurance, it's a higher premium. It's expensive. It's expensive at a time when citizens and other cabinet members are harassing the Minister of Finance because of security, because of public health, because of the condition of the roads. So how can we justify having this additional call on the recurrent budget? Well, here's the thing. The cost is going to be paid anyway. The cost is paid when the hurricane hits, when the disaster comes. So the question is not whether we can afford the additional recurrent cost. The question is, do you want to pay it on an annual basis, or wait till Melissa comes, and then everybody has to pay for it all at once? It has to be paid for. You decide whether you want to wait till it hits, and then we get another new tax package. Okay, so this brings us to the recommendations, which fall out of what the analysis we just did. Jamaica's public debt has impressively come down from nearly 150% of GDP at its peak in 2009, down to about the 60% threshold that is widely held to be where countries don't have to worry too much about debt. And certainly your lenders don't worry too much about the sustainability of your debt. But I want you to pay attention to something in this chart. Here and here. COVID, Melissa, every time we have a disaster, the debt goes back up. So it is important that you are starting off with a low debt load so that you can manage and so that your international lenders and local lenders don't get too concerned if it goes up. All of which is to say that there has been a debate occasionally in Jamaica about whether, now that we are down close to 60%, if we can sort of ease off on focusing on debt reduction and divert those resources to other pressing needs. Perhaps if you are not one of the most vulnerable economies in the world. But in light of that, lowering your ongoing public debt is the foundation of resilience. So that's recommendation number 1. Keep focusing on debt reduction. Number 2, issue a new cat bond, make it bigger. Number 3, resign for CRIF, get more insurance. Number 4, the sinking funds, the contingency fund, and the disaster reserve fund, put more aside so that we can call upon that on a regular basis. Make everything bigger. As we roll over our existing debt and we need to negotiate new debt, then ensure that we have catastrophe clauses in those bonds, meaning that your principal, your interest payments are automatically suspended if there is a disaster, and possibly your principal repayments as well. And finally, in the context of all of this, that periodically, maybe every 3 years, we have a kind of an actuarial audit, if you will, of the exposure that we face and a re-examination of the disaster risk framework in the context of that exposure to make sure it's always adequate. That is CAPRI's agenda. Thank you.
People were at gas stations fighting over gas. The police had to come break up fights. People were looting businesses. People were stealing like zinc and materials from other people's homes. It just felt like I was in an apocalypse. My name is Amani Dickinson and I am from Rose Hall, St. James. I was not in an office for basically a month after the hurricane. I was a digital sales and marketing executive before the hurricane hit. When you're surrounded by so much devastation and despair, it's hard to really focus on work. It's kind of just like, why should I market this place as somewhere that's like happy and the place to be when that's not how it feels right now? When we returned to the office, of course, things were very different because the level of revenue that was coming in before is not the same level of revenue that's coming in now because, of course, the boats and everything was just affected. And then they made my position redundant, which is sad, but it's also the reality that comes with, a natural disaster like Melissa, and Melissa was very disastrous. Job searching before this was hard enough by itself, but where before it was just like me against 5 other people, now it's like me against 20 because so many people have lost their jobs. I try to ensure that I have my portfolio updated at all times, and even if it's not an opportunity that I necessarily want, it's something that I can use as a stepping stone. Whatever comes through, whatever God say, Amani, this you have to work with right now, I just have to work with it because at the end of the day, I have to take care of myself and I also want to help take care of my loved ones. Me wondering if what the government is doing is the best use of my taxpayer dollars is not a question that I've had just now. It's a question that I've had even before the hurricane. Before my position got made redundant and I would get my paycheck and I would see how much money comes out in taxes, it's usually, I feel it in my chest. Like, I go to the supermarket, I'll take up 1 bag of rice, 1 bag of flour, probably like a chicken, and a couple other things. Boom. $15,000 just like that. Even though, like, probably last year before the hurricane, it could have covered everything that I would want to get. Putting tax on non-alcoholic sweetened beverages is supposed to contribute to an overall health aspect because, high cholesterol and diabetes run rampant in the country. That's not the issue. It's the fact that we import every single thing and people cannot afford produce, so them can't afford. Eating healthy is expensive, you know? Making decisions that would seem to be in the best interest of the country and its people. You know, tech boy, as they would have said, it's not something that's easy. But when it has been a case where I have been on the ground and I have had the feeling and I have observed that the people are doing more for us than the government, it makes me wonder what my taxpayer dollars are being used for. I would love to see something that actually benefits the people. Everything is always like, how does this affect the budget? How does this affect our spending? How does this affect the amount of money that we make? But I haven't really seen much that talks about how do we help the people that actually voted us into power? How do we help the people that actually contribute to our economic growth? The people are here and the people need help.
All right.
I don't know, but it just came to me.
All right, that's a good question. But allow me to say good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, CAPRI, for inviting me here this afternoon again. I think I might have said something wonderful last year for you to invite me back. But let me as well just acknowledge everyone that's here. I sat down before the room before everyone came in, so I'm pleasantly surprised to see so many people here this afternoon. And I hope at the end of this, you will find the discussion useful. Hello, IDV. All right. So, Damien, we don't just help the people who voted for us. As a government, we have to be concerned about everyone. Yes. And when you look at the budget, it's all, the most of it is for the people of Jamaica. So the spending on education, on health, on building roads, repairing roads, all of that obviously is for all Jamaicans. Yes, you may wake up one morning or the next morning and the next, and your road has potholes not fixed in the time frame that you'd like for it to be fixed. But somebody else's road may be getting fixed at that time based on the allocation that we have for roads and how many roads can be fixed. So this might not sound great to you if you're not feeling the government, but all the taxes that are collected goes back into paying for goods and services on behalf of all Jamaicans. It's just that the allocation of it may not be reaching you where you are.
Slido.com on your phones and put in the event code CAPRI. There's a poll. Because, of course, one of the issues raised by these disasters, which always causes borrowing to tick upwards, is does this mean that we are going to spiral into debt again? Does this give us a concern about the sustainability of the debt trajectory? So the poll on Slido is, how likely is the government targets given the financial cost of Melissa? So I would love to hear your opinion on that.
So our projection for getting back to the 60% debt to GDP is in 2030. So the end of fiscal year 29-30, that's when we expect to be back there. Why so long? Just the scale of the restructuring that needs to happen. And we need to rebuild the revenue base. We are taking on additional debt, so that comes with additional cost. And so our time frame for getting back there is longer than we had for COVID.
So that means you are to interpret the Slido poll question is, how much faith do you actually have in the minister's projections? So one of the first thing I'd like to ask you to address at this point is there was some, one of the institutional improvements that has been made in our society is the establishment of the Independent Fiscal Commission. So we have an independent body that is scrutinizing the budget in addition to CAPRI, to highlight any discrepancies that it may find and any concerns it has. And it's off to a rousingly good start because it has obligated the minister to address one of the issues raised. The Independent Fiscal Commissioner pointed out a discrepancy between your projection of almost 10% growth in nominal GDP. Now, given that real GDP, the actual amount of goods and services produced, is hardly going to grow, given Melissa, then that seems to suggest that you think that we're going to have price increases of 9–10%, but the inflation target of Bank of Jamaica is between 4 and 6%. They're expecting a 5% inflation. So you want to just reconcile those two?
Sure. Let's just say when we look at, well, if I were to give you the real GDP growth, right? And I give you what the inflation is in the economy, you should be able to take that and figure out how much inflation is in your GDP, right? Which is what this whole concept of GDP deflator. My argument was, relative to that of the fiscal commissioner, is that those two concepts are different. Your inflation that people experience in the economy, they experience it based on the things they buy. The inflation in GDP is about the cost of what is being produced in the country. If you look at what people buy, it's not only domestic items, but they also consume imported items. So that inflation could be lower than what the inflation is in your GDP, because that's the things that you're producing locally in your economy. What was happening, what we believe is happening, is that there is quite a bit of activity that has to do with construction on the part of the private sector. And I think everyone knows that the cost of service in the construction sector has risen significantly. Try finding a plumber or somebody to do something, you have to pay a lot for that person to do it. So when you measure the GDP and what's produced in the country, you're likely to see higher inflation there than you would normally when you look at what people are consuming. So those concepts are related, but they're not the same as the argument that I'm making.
So
I know it's a little bit technical, but
yeah, one of the concerns that is highlighted in CAPRI's report, when the government makes a real GDP forecast, a forecast for economic growth of actual goods and services, we kind of check to see how it aligns with other independent assessments of all of the assumptions you make. And in terms of economic growth, we were surprised so last year, your forecast of economic growth aligned quite closely with independent agencies. This year, so it looks like if I'm getting these correctly, the World Bank thinks that we're going to contract by 2%. The IMF thinks we're going to grow by 1.5%. Planning Institute says it could be anything between 1 and 3% growth. Right. And it being so, since there's no consensus about whether we're going to contract significantly or grow significantly, then as much as your forecast for modest economic growth, really modest, fits in the middle, you can't have a lot of faith in it. It's like any number can play. And if it ends up being on the low side of that, then you're going to get less tax revenue than you expect. And we have another tax package coming halfway through the year.
No, when you build, or when we build budgets, there is some level of contingency in the budget because we know we're operating in a very uncertain environment. And that's one of the first things you build in as a buffer, right? When, you know, before we get to the layers that you spoke of earlier on, and that as a practice for budgets, some buffers in there.
Okay, so the minister is saying no new taxes. You heard it here first.
Well, we are government of no new taxes.
Since you say that, and somebody asked me to ask you this, since your government, your administration has made such a big deal of no new taxes and maintained that for so long, after October, at what point did it dawn on you that you would need to come to the people and say, new taxes?
Once we began building the budgets, once we realized the scale of the damage, once we started to project where our debt to GDP would be and where our fiscal balance, our primary balance would be, then we came to that hard decision about asking the people of Jamaica for some revenues after 10 years. So it was a really tough decision, but it was a decision that we had to make because otherwise you would have had to look beyond the 5 years that we were projecting for the debt to GDP to come back to the 60%. You're looking way beyond the medium term. The other influences that are out there that Jamaicans don't see, we have 3 credit rating agencies that look at us and make a determination about, where do we fall. And all 3 came, or either we had a call with them, they learned about the scope of the disaster. They asked us, me in particular, how do I feel about the debt and when do I think it's going to come back to the 60%? And, they listened to our arguments. And they gave us, I think, the best decision that we could have ever expected to confirm our ratings at the level they were. And there was one agency that gave us an upgrade after Melissa. So, and they were saying it's based on our history, our good fiscal management. That's what influenced them. So when I look forward, debt to GDP at 60% or below is a religion for me, not just because of Melissa, but it was a religion I was preaching prior to Melissa, because, as Dr. King said, it gives you room when you have these disasters. And we know now, if we didn't know before, that we're living in a very volatile geographic space, a volatile global environment. And so it's incumbent upon us not only to have some contingency in our budgets, but to set aside some amount of money to have these instruments that are out there, to increase the size of the instruments, to have the disaster clauses or climate clauses in debt, which we do, by the way, Professor, we do in some of the existing international debt, yes. Our next step is to have the market, the public markets that we access, come to terms with having those same clauses. So again, it's a religion for me in terms of ensuring that we build back the buffers that we had coming into Melissa and make them stronger so that our budget doesn't have this volatility when we go through periods of disaster.
So Slido, well, somebody on Slido wants to know, okay, so you calculated that we need about $30 billion of taxes. Take us into the cabinet room and the Ministry of Finance and expose the discussion about what to tax. How were those decisions made? Hey, that's why we're here. You know, I told them to put a little burner under your seat so it would symbolize the hot seat. But my staff didn't think that was a good idea.
All right, so all of this emanated from the Ministry of Finance, right? I'm the first one who sees the budget. The technical people work on it. They come, they present it, they say minister this, minister that, and kind of based on what we have to do, the reconstruction, everything that we have to do, minister, this is the best. I interrogate, I say go back, come back, and they come back for the last time and say, minister, this is it. So it was my job to then take it to cabinet and presented the best case I could, because, as you said before, we are a government that for 10 years said no new taxes, and we followed through with that. So you can imagine finance minister, new finance minister, showing up and saying to my cabinet colleagues and the Prime Minister, we are going to have to ask for some revenues, additional revenues from Jamaica and from Jamaicans, and it's like right after a disaster. But we talked it through, and then when we spoke about the package, we saw that in the areas that we were looking for the revenues, we thought that those were areas that Jamaicans would understand. So, plus, I have to say, for as long as I've known Dr. Tufton, he has been arguing for a tax on sweet beverages. He's just been saying we have to change behavior. There's too much sugar in beverage. People need to know what they're drinking and so on. So for him, actually, it was one of those that he supported very, very much. But it was a tough decision. Honestly, I had to go back a few times, and the questions came at me, and we just had to talk it through, and then finally come to this decision on it. What was interesting as well, though, Damien, is that because of the fiscal commissioner, because that entity is there now and it takes a look at our budgets after we put them together. I know last year when he issued his first report, one of the things he highlighted was that government need to go to Parliament with revenue measures, if there are revenue measures. Remember last year we never had any new taxes. We had giveaways, we had give back last year. So of course you want to hold on to that until you get to make your budget speech, right? Because that's a big surprise. So we didn't table that book. This year, again, after he looked at the budgets, he highlighted that we really need to go, if you present the budget without it, without whether you're doing give backs or you're asking for new taxes, it's just incomplete. And there, his analysis would be incomplete. Now, coming with new taxes and then revealing what those are ahead of talking in Parliament, now that was not anything that anyone, including me, wanted to do. But in the end, our Prime Minister called me and he said, let's go ahead with it. And so we tabled, this is what the revenue measures are in. Has never been tabled with the other books that we table. The expenditure has never been done before. But what that did was it created space for people to discuss what was in it. And it gave me a chance to hear all the conversations out there and to explain. And so by the time I got to Parliament for the opening of the debate, I think everybody had digested whether or not they agreed. They began to realize that this was going to go through. Obviously, there were two items in it for which the industry had a real concern, and that was how we were going to implement the tax on non-alcoholic sweetened beverage. For us, it was an easy way to implement it by just taxing the beverage. I should say efficient, not easy. It was an efficient way to do it, but for the manufacturers, it didn't stack up for them. And so we had quite a bit of backing and forth listening to them, understanding their concerns, and at the end of the day, recognizing that, yes, we have to make the change and not to be resistant to the change. And so we did, even though that's not the ultimate destination. The ultimate destination is to have a tiered approach. So a low sugar drink would have a lower per gram, cents per gram versus one that's higher. So we're gonna get there. We're gonna work with the industry to get there. And similarly, on the environmental protection levy, it was the same kind of back and forth and understanding of what the concerns were, and not be afraid of saying, okay, I hear you, we're considering, we go back, we talk, and in the end, we agreed with that.
Okay, since we're talking about taxes, Minister, contrary to popular opinion, economists don't know everything. But what we do know about and know a lot about is how to tax people. And if you ask, and out of that, we know that the best taxes are the ones that are the least distortionary and the hardest to evade. When you rank taxes based on those two measures, the one that rises to the top of the list is property taxes, especially the way we do property taxes in Jamaica, which is the correct way, which is on the value of the undeveloped land rather than the entire value of the property. It is almost the obvious target for increased taxation, especially because when you look at Jamaica's property tax rates, even without the arguments about it being such a good tax, they are abysmally low. So, is this because when your party tried to increase property taxes, a few administrations ago, you had to pull back and everybody in the party was just frightened and afraid?
No, no, remember,
when Audley was finance minister.
Yeah, I was there. There. No, we rolled.
So why not property tax?
No, we rolled back some of the rates, but we went forward with property tax.
It's low.
But we did indicate that next year would be the year for property tax increases. We did indicate that.
Okay.
It's going to take the National Land Agency some time to do the valuations. They said it would take them a year because they just have to go all across Jamaica and do these valuations. So we said, fine, we'll wait until next year.
Okay. Okay, so we take that as a commitment. I'm not sure why it takes a whole year, because it's the kind of thing that you can kind of do, with a model rather than visiting every piece of land. But Fine. So that's coming. Slido wants to know if you can give us some additional details or any details on what the digital tax is going to look like, because nobody seems to understand what is going to be taxed and how.
So I gave a definition yesterday, and that's based on when you look across the world, how do other countries define what makes up the digital economy? And pretty much is anything that's digitally ordered and digitally delivered. That's one category. It could be not digitally ordered, but digitally delivered. Those are the two categories that we would apply a tax to. But when we measure our digital economy, we would include a third category of things that are not digitally ordered, but digitally delivered. Or is it the other way? Digitally.
Well,
digitally.
that's the way that makes sense.
I'm sorry.
That's the way that makes sense. Yeah, digitally delivered.
Right. Digitally ordered, digitally delivered. And you have digitally ordered but physically delivered. Those are not in the basket.
Right.
Right. Because if you're ordering something from abroad, it would already have come to the port. And then the third category is not digitally ordered, but digitally delivered.
I mean, that's justified and has to be grappled with at some point, because as technology develops, a larger share of every economy is becoming digital goods. So you really can't exempt all of that economic activity from it. Slido has asked a question. Somebody on Slido has asked a question that, in relation to my saying that, okay, we need to buy more insurance, we need to issue a higher cat bond, in a pretty flippant way, somebody on Slido is saying, in the face of Melissa, and in the face of the fact that Melissa we are likely to have more Melissas with climate change making storms stronger, is Jamaica insurable? Is Jamaica still insurable?
Well, of course it is. It's just going to be more expensive. The market will do their risk evaluation. Right now, the entity that did the pricing for the cat bond that was triggered, we've engaged them again to do the analysis, because there's, now they have to incorporate the new data points. Mm-hmm. So yes, we're still insurable. It's just going to mean that we have to pay more for it. Just like if you buy insurance for your house and your house got burned down or washed away, you are still insurable. But the cost to you might be double or 1.5 times or so on.
Yeah. The thrust of the presentation, if I may kind of encapsulate it, governments and ministers of finance have macroeconomic targets, macroeconomic goals, I should say. One of those is promoting economic growth so that standards of living rise. Another one is equity, so that inequalities and inequities don't get too large. And the thrust of the presentation is right up at the top with the goals of economic growth and increased equity should be fiscal resilience, which becomes a consideration at least equal to those other two. But as we are discussing, it's going to come at a higher cost.
Yes.
Are you prepared to go into Parliament and say, it's now going to cost us 50% more or twice as much to be able to have an adequate disaster risk framework, and to argue for it?
To argue for
in cabinet.
The framework?
To argue for a larger framework,
yes,
that's going to cost maybe twice as much as it cost before.
Absolutely. I'm just waiting for the information. to do that. As I said earlier on, the entity that did the analysis for the cap bond, they're doing new analysis. CRIF has already renewed the policy that we have with them, and we're looking at new things from them. They have new instruments, and we are looking across the world to see what else we can add to the portfolio. We have to look at what we had set aside in the National Natural Disaster Reserve Fund. We're going to have to put more aside because we saw that we were able to move swiftly to provide relief right after the storm. If we didn't have those buckets of funds that we had diligently put aside, I don't know what would have happened, right? We were able to mobilize, to clear roads, to get relief packages to persons. We were able to deploy the first responders and know that, we had funds to take care of paying them overtime or providing food, providing all of that. So we've seen just how important it is to have these buffers in our economy to protect the revenues, to protect Jamaicans, to respond to them in this period of distress. So I don't think there's anybody that would disagree with me hurrying up to put the instruments back in place and to make them even bigger. And I see IDB sitting in the second row, and I'm sure I'm going to be getting support from IDB.
So negotiations will start right after we finish here. So a member of our audience, through Slido, has raised the issue of the JPS loan, which you already know, annoyed a lot of people. $24 billion is a huge chunk of change.
Okay.
And Jamaica Public Service is a private company.
But it is our only electricity generating company en masse.
Okay, what are the
so
terms?
what would be the alternative?
Okay, what are the terms?
It's a 5-year loan, 5.5% interest rate. And if you get to that
5.5%?
Yes.
I'd like to get a loan like that.
Because, you know what? No, hold on. No. I'm glad you raised that.
Hang on.
No, Damian.
Hold on.
Damian, I'm glad you raised that.
So the forecast for inflation of the CPI is 5.1%. So the nominal interest rate is the same as the rate of inflation, which means in real terms, the loan is free.
All right. So, Damian, JPS is our only electricity generation company en masse, right? There are other people who have solar and whatever, but for the country, it's a regulated company. Its profits are regulated. All of its costs have to be borne by the users. So if we put a high interest rate on the loan, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get passed through in your electricity bill. So government was thinking of the population when we were negotiating this loan. Plus, what else do you think is going to happen if we didn't give that loan? The island would probably still be in darkness. Because JPS, and I've heard the CEO speak, JPS did not have the kind of equipment, the kind of skill set that the 150 million could buy in rapid time. It was just massive. It was just on a scale we had never seen before. So people have to consider what would the alternative be? What would the situation be otherwise if we didn't do this?
Okay. I mean, it is true based on, and wearing another hat in terms of oversight of JPS. Yes, it ultimately will get passed on. So people would pay for it anyway.
Yeah.
So we have put in place as I referred to before, an impressive disaster risk framework. And by the way, not many countries have a framework like what Jamaica has. So it's a real achievement of our administration. But when the hurricane hits, then we scramble around for channels of issuing relief. When COVID hit, we scrambled around for channels of relief. Isn't it time now that we do for relief what we have done for managing disasters? To put in place an architecture and predetermined channels so that when masses of the country need assistance and support, those already exist. People know how to apply for them on a fair basis, instead of having to wonder, who's getting the benefit and who's not, and why are some not getting it. Because as we discovered, disasters are going to come along on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. That's another building block that we have to have in the society. It's good that we're able to do most of the relief assistance to persons electronically, but I agree with you in terms of having those channels preset, predetermined. And in much the same way, we have the disaster risk financing. Yes, we need to look at a policy that would say, okay, how do we behave after a disaster in terms of the relief that we have to give to persons? Obviously, we might not know what the disaster is going to be. The next time it might be, oh God, I'm not going to say it. I'm not putting it in the space. But in much the same way as we were able to define a framework for disaster risk financing, we should be able to do that as well, so we're prepared. It's a building block, because if you look back in our history, we didn't have all the things then that we have today. But as we go through these disasters, we realize, okay, let's put this in place so that the next time we're better prepared.
And I'm glad you mentioned that it should be disaster agnostic, because if you reflect upon the list of disasters I mentioned in my presentation, many of them are novel. We know hurricanes are going to come along. Not many of us foresaw the banking crisis. Not many of us foresaw a pandemic. Disasters have a way of being unexpected and novel. So that's important. Mm-hmm. But there's a great deal of distrust of how government distributes benefits and who gets it. So that architecture is important. That architecture of distribution and relief is important, not just for efficiency, but also for having trust in government. My final question, Minister. You have been in the seat now for almost a year and a half. What have you learned?
I've learned that there is real discipline in our budgeting process. And that's very important for Jamaicans to know. I have learned that there is good stewardship of the funds that Jamaicans entrust to the government. And that all the institutions that we've been putting in place over the years, they've helped us to be at this point where, and I'm going to refer to it again, our international rating agency could confirm our credit rating after a Category 5 hurricane. And it's because they have seen us over the last however many years, and they can compare and look at all the institutions that we've built. They have faith and confidence in the budget process, in the buffers that we have put in place, and it's not just disaster buffer, it's the NIR. So the war that's raging in the Middle East, we yes, the prices are high and we're going to feel some of that high price, but we're not worried about whether or not we can get foreign exchange to buy oil. Those are all the things that, when I sit back and take a look at the building process that has happened over the last however many years you want to say, I feel really proud of the work that has been going on to reduce the risk of our budget, to reduce the risk generally for Jamaicans. They may not feel it because in a disaster, they may feel that they should be getting more, but I'm saying to Jamaicans, it could be a whole lot worse if we hadn't taken these steps to put these buffers in place and to stick to it rather than in a moment you go, oh no, let's do that. No, just to have the discipline about the process and to recognize, I'm sure you've heard me say many times, the debt to GDP at 60% or below is something we need to get to. And that's because it provides room for you to borrow in those periods when you need to borrow. And to go from 60% to 68%, the rating agencies will look through that. And why are rating agencies important? Because if they slash your credit rating, instantly the cost of your debt goes up and it just compounds your budget in a negative way. And so when I opened the budget, the budget debate, and I said, our credit rating is our oil, it is our gold. I wasn't joking, I wasn't being facetious. It is our oil and it is our gold, and we have to protect it and work to get better ratings, because there's a real cost and a real benefit to us having good credit worthiness, being able to access markets in times like this. Our international partners would not have come together in the way they did. The IDB, IMF, World Bank, CAF, our Caribbean entity, they would not have come together in the way they did to offer the $6.7 billion of support. 2.4 billion of that is the crowd in the private sector. They just wouldn't have, they would not have that confidence in Jamaica. So these things, though they're not things that you can eat and drink or wear, or you don't see it in your roads, but they are important given the risks that can befall us, or given given where we're located geographically, given what we're exposed to in the rest of the world. We just have to be way more conservative than other countries would be.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, Minister Williams. Jamaica's financial and national development story is demonstrated in our budget, and tonight, what makes this story impactful is the fact that you chose to show up, ask questions, and engage. In a time when we're reminded through events like Hurricane Melissa of how quickly circumstances can shift, conversations like these become even more important and powerful. They ground us in facts, sharpen our priorities, and help us ensure that our decisions are practical and efficient for the future. I must thank our presenter, Dr. Damian King, and the Honorable Favour Williams for a candid and illuminating exchange this evening. Your insights have given us all a great deal to think about. A sincere thank you to Restaurants of Jamaica and Mrs. Matalon for sponsoring this work, and also the good corporate citizens and international partners who support CAPRI's work in the public interest throughout the year. Your partnership makes research like these possible. Today, you're a part of a special conversation that does not stop here. Please look at your agenda and scan the QR code on the bottom left of the front side. If you're unable to scan the QR code, you can visit CAPRI's website, capricaribbean.org, to view the 2026 Budget Breakdown Report. If you're seeing the report, we have officially passed on the baton to you. We encourage you to read it, share it, and continue the conversation in your homes, your boardrooms, online, and in your communities. And before you go, follow us on social media and keep an eye out for our next event, which will be an analysis of child-focused spending. So we will be taking our budget analysis to children, and you don't want to miss that. On behalf of the CAPRI team, thank you for being here. Good night.